And welcome to the video, and in this video I'm going to be reading another piece of legislation. This is the new domestic terrorism bill, or at least a draft of it. Looks to be the initial draft. HR350 from the 117th Congress. Once again, I am not a lawyer. Don't ask me for legal advice. You can ask me for advice though all you want, and I will make sure to give you bad advice. I have not read this bill yet. Let's read it together and see if this contains any nightmare fuel. It probably does. So, a bill to authorize dedicated domestic terrorism offices within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to analyze and monitor domestic terrorist activity and require the federal government to take steps to prevent domestic terrorism. How many security agencies do we have in this country already? Holy hell. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. The short title, this act may be cited as the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021. In this act, the term director means a director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The term domestic terrorism has the meaning given to the term in Section 2331 of Title 18 United States Code, except that it does not include acts perpetrated by individuals with or inspired by. Now, before I continue, I'm not going to look up 2331 of Title 18. I will allow you to do that. After all, I'm lazy myself, and I just don't want to do everything for you. Anyways, a foreign person or organization designated as a foreign terrorist organization under Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is 8 U.S.C. 1189. An individual or organization designated under Executive Order 13224. A state sponsor of terrorism determined by the Secretary of State under Section 6 Juliet of the Export Administration Act of 1979, Section 40 of the Arms Export Control Act, or Section 620 Alpha of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. So that's a lot of places to draw definitions from. Anyways, nothing really worthwhile. I was just thinking there and making sure I was getting what it said. Okay, 3. The term Domestic Terrorism Executive Committee means the committee within the Department of Justice tasked with assessing and sharing information about ongoing domestic terrorism threats. The term hate crime incidents means an act described in Section 241, 245, 247, or 249 of Title 18, or in Section 901 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. The term Secretary means Secretary of Homeland Security, and the term Uniformed Forces has the meaning given to the term in Section 101 Alpha of Title 10 United States Code. Now, we've only been reading the definitions, and so far, this just seems to me like a way to put people in jail longer. Or maybe institute the death penalty in a wider array. Let's continue. Section 3. Offices to combat domestic terrorism. Authorization of offices to monitor, analyze, investigate, and prosecute domestic terrorism. 1. Domestic Terrorism Unit. Yes, I can speak. There is authorized a domestic terrorism unit in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis of the Department of Homeland Security, which shall be responsible for monitoring and analyzing domestic terrorism activities. Domestic Terrorism Office. There is authorized a domestic terrorism office in the counterterrorism section of the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, which shall be responsible for investigating and prosecuting incidents of domestic terrorism and which shall be headed by the Domestic Terrorism Council. domestic terrorism section of the FBI. There is authorized a domestic terrorism section within the counterterrorism division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which shall be responsible for investigating domestic terrorism activities. So, the FBI already has a counterterrorism unit. So why write a bill? Okay, moving on. Staffing. The Secretary, the Attorney General, and the Director shall each ensure that each office authorized under this section in their respective agencies shall have adequate number of employees to perform the required duties, have not less than one employee dedicated to insurance compliant with civil rights and civil liberties laws and regulations, and require that all employees undergo an annual anti-bias training. Oh, that doesn't sound fun or anything. By the way, in case you're wondering, this is only 16 pages long, so this is not going to be a very long video. Sunset. The offices authorized under this subsection shall terminate on a date that is 10 years after the date of the enactment of this act. Well, that sounds all fine and dandy, but how many times has the Patriot Act and the AUMF, the authorized use of military force, been re-upped? Joint report on domestic terrorism. Biannual report required not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act, and each 6 months thereafter for the 10-year period beginning on the date of enactment of this act. The Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General, and the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation shall submit a joint report authorized by domestic terrorism offices authorized under paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 of subsection Alpha 2. Alpha, the Committee on the Judiciary, the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and the Select Committee on the Intelligence of the Senate, and the Committee on the Judiciary, the Committee on Homeland Security, and the Permanent Select Committee on the Intelligence of the House of Representatives. 2. Contents. Each report submitted under paragraph 1 shall include an assessment of domestic terrorism threat posed by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, including white supremacists and neo-Nazi infiltration of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and the uniformed services. This is very specific. Here is where I'm drawing a big problem with this legislation. Now, on one hand, I think I will have to go look up the definition of terrorism from the U.S. Code. But here we're talking about white supremacists. Well, what about black supremacists? What about Martian supremacists? What about rabbit enthusiasts? Very specific language like this is always a concern of mine. But then again, they haven't really defined what a white supremacist is in this legislation, have they? And we've already gone through the definitions. Moving on. In the first report, analysis of incidents or attempted incidents of domestic terrorism that have occurred in the United States since April 19, 1995, including any white supremacist-related incidents or attempted incidents, and in each subsequent report, an analysis of incidents or attempted incidents of domestic terrorism that occurred in the United States during the preceding 6 months, including any white supremacist-related incidents or attempted incidents, and a quantitative analysis of domestic terrorism for the preceding 6 months, including the number of domestic terrorism-related assessments initiated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including the number of assessments from each classification subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacism. Domestic terrorism-related preliminary investigations initiated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including the number of preliminary investigations from each classification and subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacism, and how many preliminary investigations resulted from assessments. Domestic terrorism-related full investigations initiated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including the number of full investigations from each classification and subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacism, and how many full investigations resulted from preliminary investigations and assessments. Domestic terrorism related incidents, including the number of incidents from each classification and subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacism, the number of deaths and injuries resulting from each incident, and a detailed explanation of each incident. I hope this is as fun for you as it is for me. Just to scroll along here. Okay, there's only a couple more. Federal domestic terrorism related arrests, including the number of arrests from each classification and subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacism, and a detailed explanation of each arrest. Federal domestic terrorism related events, including the number of indictments from each classification and subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacism, and a detailed explanation of each indictment. Wow, this is wordy as shit. So far this says, oh, well, we want the indictments. And for events where there weren't indictments, let's get the arrests. And for events where there weren't arrests, let's get the incidents. Federal domestic terrorism-related prosecutions, including the number of incidents from each classification and subcategory, with a specific classification or subcategory for those related to white supremacists, and a detailed explanation of each prosecution. Convictions says the same thing, but convictions, and then it says the same thing in weapons recoveries. Oh, that's interesting. So far, reading this, it's a bill to make a whole giant list of who's bad. We have that already. It's called the court system. This seems more ridiculous than I thought it would be. An explanation of each individual case that progressed through more than one of the stages described under clause, including the specific classification or subcategory for each case. So far, what I'm reading is that this bill wants to spend millions of taxpayer dollars just to make a certain type of naughty list. I am not on board with this. Hate crimes. In compiling a joint report under this subsection, the domestic terrorism offices authorized under paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 and of subsection alpha shall, in consultation with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, review each hate crime incident reported during the preceding 6 months to determine whether the incident also constitutes a domestic terrorism related incident. I'm realizing before I said that I didn't like it when language was specific. I realize now that was a brain fart. I really don't like it when language is vague, but when language gets really specific, as it was in that case, where it's talking about white supremacism, that's when I look for definitions. Since there are no definitions so far, well, anybody could be a white supremacist. Hell, from what I'm reading so far, even if you're black, you could be a white supremacist. Now I'm thinking of a Dave Chappelle skit. It's also interesting that this bill is looking at the preceding 6 months. Preceding 6 months from when? The writing of this bill? The enactment of this bill? That's just sloppy legislation. But I'm sure they're going to try and say that this has something to do with Trump and being supported by white supremacists. This entire bill looks like it wants to fulfill a narrative and spend millions of dollars to do so. Classification and public release. Each report submitted shall, under paragraph 1, shall be unclassified to the greatest extent possible with a classified annex only if necessary. In the case of the unclassified portion of the report posted on public websites of the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Oh, they're going to make the naughty list public. They're going to publicly shame you. This sounds very China. Non-duplication. If there are two or more provisions of this subsection or any other law, if two or more provisions of this subsection or any other law impose requirements on an agency to report and analyze information on domestic terrorism that are substantially similar, the agency shall construe such provisions as mutually supplemental so as to provide for the most extensive reporting or analysis, and shall comply with each such requirement as fully as possible. In other words, expect the reports to be wordy. Domestic Terrorism Executive Committee. There is authorized a Domestic Terrorism Executive Committee which shall meet on a regular basis and not less regularly than 4 times each year to coordinate with the United States attorneys and other key public safety officials across the country to promote information sharing, ensure an effective, responsive, and organized joint effort to combat domestic terrorism, and be co-chaired by the Domestic Terrorism Council and authorized under subsection Alpha Do Bravo, the United States Attorney or Assistant United States Attorney, a member of the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, and a member of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This, more and more, I just get the feeling that this just wants to say white people bad. Let's lock up white people. You know what? Let's put them in camps. You know what? Maybe we should burn the white people. They're the problem with this country, right? Ridiculous. I always find it interesting how people repeat the same things that they have done onto them and then go through many mental gymnastics to justify them. I mean, I can point to a certain country located in the Middle East, but that's always the story, isn't it? That's what it means to be human, is to justify your desire to eliminate somebody else, even though it's really just because you're a weak individual. Moving on. Focus on greatest threats. The domestic terrorism offices authorized under paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 of subsection Alpha shall focus their limited resources on the most significant domestic terrorism threats, as determined by the number of domestic terrorism-related incidents from each category and subclassification in the joint report for the preceding 6 months required under subsection Bravo. So what are they going to do? Find out that white supremacists are not the only problem and go after everybody? You know, I do know about a black guy that was going around shooting people in Chicago. Shot a lot of people. Never made it to the news. What would that person be classified as? Section 4, Training to Combat Domestic Terrorism. Oh, this should be fun. Required training and resources. The Secretary, the Attorney General, and the Director shall review the anti-terrorism training and resource programs of their respective agencies that are provided to federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies, including the state and local anti-terrorism program that is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance of the Department of Justice, and ensure that such programs include training and resources to assist state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies in understanding, detecting, deterring, and investigating acts of domestic terrorism and white supremacist and neo-Nazi infiltration of law enforcement and corrections agencies. I'm going to have a few things to say after this. The domestic terrorism training shall focus on the most significant domestic terrorism threats as determined by quantitative analysis in the joint report under Section 3 Bravo. Yeah, it's not like we're just going to leave things out of that quantitative report, are we? And I'm pretty sure this domestic terrorism training is, yeah, let's hook you up with some surveillance equipment and you can monitor everybody. Bravo requirement. Any individual who provides domestic terrorism training under this section shall have expertise in domestic terrorism and relevant academic, law enforcement, or other community-based experience in matters related to domestic terrorism. The report, in general, not later than 6 months after the date of the enactment of this Act, and twice each year thereafter, the Secretary, the Attorney General, and the Director shall each submit a biannual report of committees to the committees of Congress described in Section 3 Bravo 1 on the domestic terrorism training implemented by their respective agencies under their section, which shall include copies of all training materials used and the names and qualifications of the individuals who provided training. Boring stuff. The classification and public release. Each report submitted under paragraph 1 shall be unclassified, blah blah blah, just like I said before. Interagency task force. In general, not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this Act, the Attorney General, the Director, the Secretary, and the Secretary of Defense shall establish an interagency task force to analyze and combat white supremacist and neo-Nazi infiltration of the uniformed services and federal law enforcement agencies. Report. In general, not... Okay, I'm just going to start to skip stuff. Alright, stuff that the report shall be made public. Okay, things can be public. Department of Justice support for hate crime incidents with a nexus to domestic terrorism. Community Relations Service. The Community Relations Service of Department of Justice, authorized under Section 1001 Alpha of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, may offer the support of the service to communities where the Department of Justice has brought charges in a hate crime incident that has a nexus to domestic terrorism. Federal Bureau of Investigation, blah blah blah. Authorization appropriations, blah blah blah. Nothing important. Okay. Now, let me get back here. And as they say, we're doing it live. Typey sounds. So, let's see. Alright, here we go. Let's move this over. The term domestic terrorism means activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws of the United States or of any state. Appears to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of government by intimidation or coercion, to affect the conduct of the government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. Okay, now let me get into all of this. Do I believe that there are some people who are white supremacists that have made their ways in the law enforcement to use that as a way to facilitate their racial desires? Yes. Would I like to see something done about that? Yes. Do I think this bill is aimed towards that? No. Do I think we can do something specifically about that? No. You see, it's a very slippery slope. A crime is a crime is a crime. And the motivations for which you're not going to change by simply saying one motivation is worse than another. Because motivations are ultimately subjective. And yes, people can explicitly say things, I hate so and so, and I want to do so and so. But at the end of the day, a lot of that can just be made up. It's not like any time in our history, information about people have either been purposely misconstrued or just fabricated to make some action appear worse than it actually is. There's often a problem with what I like to call keystone legislation. Let's take something that touches a nerve, shall we? The Second Amendment. Now, the Second Amendment, realistically, you can say, is acknowledgement of nature, not human nature, nature in general. The fact that creatures evolved to survive, some of which being able to fight off their predators. That is something that the Second Amendment embodies. However, we have restrictions to the Second Amendment, whether or not a person is a criminal or mentally unstable. Well, in many cases now, if you want to prevent somebody from having a gun, you just make them a criminal. And it's not like anybody's ever been criminalized without a just reason, haven't they? So when we try to pick apart things like this, it is, in certain cases, a noble gesture, but it ultimately winds up being folly, and winds up being a way to pick winners and losers, to pick people that you want to suffer very little and people that you want to suffer very much by saying that they are or are not something. Do I have an answer for you? No. You want answers? Go do a math problem. There are no answers in life. There are only directions we can go and seeing where they land us. So that is all for this video, dear frenemy. Feel free to voice your concerns or appreciation on this legislation.